Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Are depressed Democrats screwing up the economic data? So asks Zero Hedge in a recent article asking if, quote, insanely partisan survey responses are trying to spark a recession, noting that, quote, since Trump was elected, hard data, the actual economic values, have strengthened, but so-called soft data, driven by surveys, has plunged. To give a sense, the University of Michigan Inflation Survey asks Americans what they expect inflation to be. It's one of the most influential indicators in the economy, so influential that the Fed uses it as a guidepost for rates. The latest Michigan numbers are downright weird. So Republicans expect inflation for the next year to crash from 3.6% to just 0.1%, which is almost deflation. But Democrats expect inflation to soar from 1.7% under Biden to 6.5%. The hard data so far agrees with Republicans. I mentioned recently that Trump cut monthly CPI by half, while Truflation's real-time inflation is just 1.9%, but apparently what you see depends who you voted for. Same with Michigan's 5-year expectations, which covers Trump's entire term, so Dems went from expecting 2.7% inflation under Biden to 4.6%, while Republicans went from 3.4% to just 1.3%. In other words, one of the key economic indicators is currently a poll on whether you like Donald Trump. In fact, the media complained when Jerome Powell dismissed a bump in the Michigan index as a, quote, outlier, which is a polite term for garbage. The problem is Trump derangement is rippling through all of the soft data: consumer spending, confidence, whether jobs are plentiful. We've seen recent drops in survey-based indexes from Michigan's consumer sentiment and Conference Board's leading indicators to the Fed's Empire State Manufacturing Index. So even as hard data has been strong across the board with falling inflation, rising spending, and soaring investment. Now, the solution is easy. Just ignore the soft survey data and wait for the real numbers to roll in. But first, of course, media won't do that. They are desperate for doomer porn. Second, it blinds us. It becomes much harder as an investor or policymaker to know what's happening when you're driving without headlights. Third, even deranged voters do affect the real economy. So they might spend less, they might save more, pull their money out of stocks, and sit in cash. They're shooting themselves in the foot, but it could give you a dip in stock markets and a self-fulfilling soft patch in the economy. So what's next? American media is splitting voters into two separate worlds. In the legacy media, we're plunging into a dystopian abyss and will soon be eating the cats. For the rest of us, the world is healing, and it's time to build. Last time we were here was Ronald Reagan's first term, where he implemented Trumpian growth policies like tax reform, regulatory reform, and oil. But Reagan, too, was dealing with an inherited recession from Jimmy Carter. Now, back then, the recession won. Reagan spent most of his first term getting past Carter's mess in a pair of short but deep recessions. But even with the recessions, it was the mother of stock booms. The S&P 500 went up 172% under Reagan. The Dow went up 183%. Suggesting the play here is if Dems walk away from the table, go ahead and scoop up their chips. Consumers are on fire. New numbers say consumer spending and incomes are taking off under Donald Trump. Hardest hit are legacy journalists still furiously stabbing their voodoo dolls for a recession. Last week, the Department of Commerce released fresh numbers on spending and income. This was the first report under Trump. So there's a lot of attention on it, and it was on fire. Personal consumption expenditures jumped 5.3% annualized. That's up from negative 3.3% in Biden's last month, so the consumer is coming back. Incomes did even better, up 9.7% annualized. Disposable income, which is after-tax money, actually hit 10.9% annualized, which is up a third from Biden's last. Combine this with Trump's inflation numbers. I mentioned last week, Trump cut annualized CPI in half, while Truflation's real-time gauge is currently at just 1.8% annual inflation. Legacy media, of course, did what they could to spin it, while Reuters played it straight with, quote, U.S. consumer spending rebounds. CNN headlined these very same numbers as, quote, consumers are spending less, while literally reporting in the first paragraph that consumers are spending more, and then waiting till the 19th paragraph before mentioning that incomes are soaring. Stock market sadly fell since our Federal Reserve-dominated market actually likes pain because it means the Fed will dump more cheap money into markets, while when Americans are doing well, as now, might be good for business, but it is bad for the money printer on which markets subsist. Indeed, the Fed is currently deer in the headlights since they were unprepared for the falling inflation and soaring growth Trump is delivering so far. So the backstory here is the Fed generally tries to lower rates since its job is to print money. That's why Wall Street bribed it into existence. Lower rates mean more borrowing, which effectively prints money, meaning lower rates make inflation go up. Of course, if inflation is already high, they can't lower rates. That would send inflation to double digits, and that's why the Fed has been keeping rates high through the Biden administration. But with Trump bringing inflation down, rate cuts could be on the menu, meaning lower rates on everything from car loans to mortgages to credit cards. The problem is rapid growth also leads to more borrowing, which in our crony fiat banking system also drives inflation. This puts the Fed in a holding pattern. Lower inflation makes them want to cut, higher growth scares them off. So what's next? Trump's economic numbers so far have been stellar, cutting inflation in half, raising income growth by a third, pulling consumer spending out of the gutter. In fact, they've been too good. 4 years of Joe Biden should be more of a hangover. So my base case is still a good chance of a paper recession as slowing government spending and mass deportations hit before the new factories and small businesses can make up the gap. Still, for now, these are great numbers. Hopefully we see a lot more. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. The Democrat Party has its lowest ever approval rating, and top Democrats fear things could get much worse. Yes, the world is healing. So reports left-wing Axios offering no less than 21 reasons why the Democrat Party is doomed, kicking off with a new CNN poll showing the Democrat Party has its lowest favorability rating ever, with just 29% of Americans holding a favorable view of the party. For perspective, this time in Trump's first term, Dems had a 44% favorability. The party is hemorrhaging working-class voters, the young and Hispanics. Gen Z is turning even more conservative than Gen X, which is Donald Trump's base. Democrats had been counting on mass migration for new voters, but a recent poll of 26 million Americans found a 23-point swing for Trump among immigrants. Axios thinks this all gets much worse, saying the party has no popular leader, little hope of winning the midterms given the Senate map, and polarized House districts, and most important, quote, dwindling influence over media, as Americans increasingly turn from network news and newspapers to podcasts and social media, where conservatives compete on even footing or even dominate. A senior advisor to Bill Clinton calls it the, quote, deepest hole since Ronald Reagan's sweep. So what happened? In short, the party handed control to the special interests, the radical activists, the government workers and NGOs, and corporations intimidated or bribed into switching parties by a heady mix of rioting activists and bureaucrats weaponizing predatory regulation and trillion-dollar government grants. The result of all this special interest takeover is a party unrecognizable to the traditional Democrat coalition of blue collars, the elderly, and minorities. All of these groups are socially conservative. None of them are down with naked drag shows for kids or free houses and healthcare for illegals. Now, I mentioned in a recent video how Bill Clinton ran on traditional family values, lower government spending, like DOGE, and a strong border, all policies with 80% support. Today, Dems are instead chasing down the 20% issues. The reason they're doing this, of course, is it pays. Billions from corporations and corrupt NGOs fund their campaigns, while 50 years of media control has meant they can get away with outright corruption and count on journalists to hide it. That house of cards is now collapsing. Thanks to Elon Musk and thousands of people like me, outsiders can compete with legacy media and get our message out to even Democrat voters. So what's next? After every election, they write obituaries for the losing party, but this time is different. Democrat support is in free fall. Remember that 44% in 2017 going to just 29%. Now, if I were rooting for the Dems, I'd tell them to publicly repudiate the social radicals, look to Bill Clinton's so-called Sister Souljah moment. Then I'd tell them to latch on to every 80% policy they can find, even if Trump supports it. So controlled borders, deporting criminals, safe streets, lower taxes, less red tape, helping small businesses, and even DOGE. Of course, Dems are not listening to me because they cannot. They are hostage to the money and the activists it spawned. Democrats' best hope may be the party implodes so spectacularly that they have to evict the corrupt and the crazies and get back to listening to their actual voters. Federal spending is still rising despite $130 billion in savings from the Department of Government Efficiency. How do we stop this train? Last week, the Hamilton Project, which tracks government spending based on Treasury data, reported the federal government has spent $1.91 trillion so far in calendar 2025, which is approximately $100 billion more than it spent last year. Legacy media was positively giddy. MarketWatch crowd, quote, despite Elon Musk's promises, Trump's spending is on pace to surpass Biden levels. Of course, the truth is all of this is inherited from Washington's drunkest sailor, that very same Joe Biden. So about 60 of the $100 billion is inflation. Joe left us with over 3% inflation last year. Another 12 is interest on the debt, thanks to Biden giving us over $2 trillion in new debt last year. Still, that leaves Trump spending $28 billion more than Joe Biden. Of course, there's a very good reason for that. This is Joe Biden's budget. So the way budgets work in Washington is they start in September, meaning Trump doesn't even get a budget for another 6 months. We are still living in Joe Biden's world. That budget largely continued spending from the previous year, with the big exception of so-called entitlement programs, which had a projected $200 to $400 billion rise. Now, entitlements make up most of federal spending, and they include good things like Social Security and Medicare, but also bad things like industrial fraud and huge chunks of the NGO and migrant industrial complex. Many of those are also frauds. These are where DOGE is focusing cuts, and it is where legacy media is trying to score points, characterizing anti-fraud as forcing grandma to eat cat food. Meanwhile, most of DOGE that has been done isn't showing up yet. So many of the canceled contracts were multi-month or even multi-year, meaning the savings are coming. Thousands of laid-off federal workers are still getting paid. They got severance or voluntary buyouts can actually cost more. Meanwhile, the district judges who apparently outrank the democratically elected president keep forcing spending that Trump tries to cut. Even migrant welfare is partly being rerouted to deportations, which cost money and, again, offer future savings but are not showing up yet. So what's next? In recent videos, I've talked about the paper recession you get from reductions in government spending. That's not showing up yet, mostly because we're still coasting on Joe Biden's fumes. With the possible exception of Metro Washington, D.C., which is a parasite masquerading as a city, and some forward-looking economic numbers like consumer spending or stock markets where people are anticipating the future. Still, DOGE reports over $130 billion in cuts, which will be unfolding as the year progresses, and especially if we get a congressional budget come September that actually does lock in the savings. Elon is doing everything he can, Trump's doing everything he can, but serious reductions are going to come down to Congress, who has to decide, do they actually hand savings back to the people, or do they revert to character and find some way to respend every last dime? In the meantime, and until Congress does grow a spine, spending will keep going up, and our nation's bankruptcy will keep getting closer. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada. They're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. In crypto, we read about new hacks every week with top coins spiraling into oblivion. Except for Bitcoin. It has never been hacked. The enormous innovations going into crypto will ultimately migrate to the gold standard of Bitcoin. Trammell Venture Partners is a Bitcoin-native venture capital firm that's been around since the beginning back in 2009. They back some of the top brands in the industry, including Kraken and Unchained. Check out the third annual report on Bitcoin-native startups, tracking nearly $1.2 billion in early-stage Bitcoin-native software startups. Visit tvp.fund. Now back to our show. Will humans go extinct? In an interview last week, Elon Musk was asked what keeps him up at night. His response was that crashing birth rates could destroy civilization or even wipe out humanity. Noted that in some countries, births are now 1/3 replacement level. In Japan, for example, on average, 4 grandparents lead to a single grandchild. In Korea, every 100 Koreans will become just 8 great-grandchildren. China is on track to lose 600 million people in a single lifetime. Europe's not far behind. Fertility rates for native-born Europeans are around about 1.3, meaning you lose 1/3 of your people every generation. For native-born Italians, it's nearly half lost per generation. The U.S. is similar to Europe. Native-born fertility of any race is at a record low 1.5 per couple, meaning you lose 1/4 of all Americans per generation. The collapse is worldwide, including many countries you might not expect, so fertility is now below replacement in nearly all of Latin America and East Asia, half the Middle East, including Turkey and Iran. It's below replacement in Bangladesh and India. Even sub-Saharan Africa went from 7 kids a generation ago to just 4 today. For perspective, that's the fertility rate of the U.S. just before World War I. So what's driving the collapse? 3 things that change the cost-benefit of kids. Kids don't earn, they cost a lot, and you don't need them when you get old. In other words, urbanization, college, and pensions. So rather than kids helping on the farm or in the family business, urbanization and the decline of small business left kids as pure cost. College blows that up to more than $200,000 per child. Meanwhile, the same urbanization costs and relentless inflation since the Fed was born drove mothers into the workforce, meaning now the kids potentially cost a second income. Finally, government pensions replaced nature's pensions kids with a government check from public schools that actively turn kids against their parents. Put it together, and kids were financial assets in 1910 America or 1970 Japan, but today kids are financial costs, indeed enormous costs. So what's next? What is the solution? We've got 3 very good ones. First is income, make it easier to work part-time, which is already happening, and to start a small business, which has been in free fall in the West. This lets women have a meaningful career with kids, while the kids can start earning in their teens, whether it's website design or mowing lawns. Second is costs. Inflation and stagnant wages force parents into 2-income careers and unban the competency tests that used to do for free what college now does for $100,000. Third is pensions. Minimal government pensions force parents to have kids. This is not politically palatable, but it is the truth. And finally, direct payments. Japan and Sweden give out thousands in baby bonuses that have been largely ineffective. Hungary just combined that with a lifelong income tax exemption for mothers that hopefully should work better. We can absolutely fix population decline, but it means ending the government policies that are driving it. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.